My Ring camera caught my wife kissing a stranger on our porch, so I came home early and learned the truth was already living in my house. Daniel and Brooke had met in their mid-20s, back when busy meant happy hours after work and weekend road trips where they argued playfully about music. Brooke had been magnetic, quick jokes, bright eyes, the kind of warmth that pulled people close. Dan had been steady, less flash, more foundation. They balanced each other. They built the kind of life that looked good in Christmas cards, a 2-story house in a clean suburban neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, 2 kids, Liam, 8, and Ava, 5, a golden retriever that shed like a second job. Dan worked as a project manager for a regional construction firm, traveling to oversee commercial builds. Brooke worked part-time at a boutique and ran the house like a captain, schedules and lunches and birthday gifts handled before anyone even realized they existed. The trouble didn't start like a movie. It started like a slow leak. Brooke began talking about being alone when Dan traveled. At first it sounded like normal loneliness, missing a spouse, resenting the empty side of the bed. Dan tried to be better. He FaceTimed more. He brought back little gifts from airports. He did the dishes without being asked on weekends home. But Brooke's loneliness didn't soften when he tried. It sharpened. She started going out more when he was away, girls' nights, networking, just getting out of the house. Dan wanted to be supportive. He told himself this was healthy. She deserved a life beyond carpools and folding laundry. She deserved to feel like herself. Then came the small changes that felt too sharp to ignore. She stopped wearing her wedding ring as often, claiming her fingers swelled or the setting snagged on clothes. She got new lingerie, more deliberate, less married couple trying to keep the spark, more someone is about to see this for the first time. She became suddenly protective of her phone, flipping it face down, taking it into the bathroom, snapping, "Can I have one thing that's mine?" if Dan asked who'd texted. And there was the way she spoke to him on calls during trips, like he was interrupting her. "Hey," he'd say, trying to sound upbeat from some hotel room. "How are the kids?" "They're fine," she'd answer, distracted. Not unkind, exactly. Just, elsewhere. He tried to tell himself it was stress. Parenting. Money. Life. But sometimes, late at night in some unfamiliar city, Dan would sit on the edge of a hotel bed and stare at the ceiling and feel a sour certainty creeping in. Brooke didn't miss him. She missed being unobserved. When Dan was gone, she lived like she was free. And when he came home, it was like she put her marriage back on the hook by the door. The night Dan saw the porch kiss, he didn't move for a long time. He replayed it once. Twice. 10 times. Each replay landed differently. The first was disbelief. The second was nausea. The fifth was rage so hot it made his ears ring. By the 10th, the rage had hollowed into something colder and more terrifying. He sat up in the hotel bed, thumb hovering over the record option, and forced his hand to work. He saved the clip. He screen-recorded the playback. He emailed it to himself and uploaded it to a cloud drive he'd never used before. His brain moved like it belonged to someone else, methodical, survival-focused, while his chest felt like it had been pried open with a crowbar. Brooke and the man disappeared inside. The camera kept recording, now just the empty porch and the small flicker of the motion sensor adjusting. Dan stared at the stillness afterward, like maybe the universe would correct itself. Like maybe Brooke would step back out, laugh, and say it was a prank. Like maybe the last 11 years hadn't been rearranged in one ugly clip. He called Brooke. Straight to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. A third time. Voicemail. Dan's hands shook so hard he had to set the phone down. His mind sprinted through possibilities, trying to bargain with reality. Maybe it was her cousin. A friend. A neighbor. A misunderstanding. But he'd seen how she touched the man's chest like she knew the exact shape of him. He'd seen the way her smile lifted, effortless and young. That wasn't a friend. That was practice. He checked the timeline on the Ring app. Motion alerts over the past month. He hadn't looked closely before, he'd been busy, trusting, exhausted. Now he scrolled. There were other alerts, late at night, during his trips. Some were nothing. But some showed the same man arriving, cap, broad shoulders, sometimes carrying takeout, sometimes coming empty-handed like he didn't need to bring anything because he wasn't a guest. Dan's throat tightened as he realized what the pattern meant. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a routine. Dan got up, paced the hotel room, and felt his stomach heave. He made it to the bathroom just in time, vomiting until his eyes watered and his ribs ached. When he looked up in the mirror, his face didn't look like his face. It looked like someone who'd been robbed, eyes wide, skin gray, lips cracked. Then, like his body had flipped a switch to protect him, the tears stopped. He rinsed his mouth, wiped his face, and stared at himself. He whispered, not as a question but as a statement, okay. Not okay like fine. Okay like game on. The next morning, he didn't confront her on the phone. He didn't blow up her life in a text. He didn't call her parents or their friends or post anything online. He did what he'd always done under pressure. He planned. He checked his flights and found an earlier one. He told his boss there was a family emergency. He left a short message for the hotel front desk and walked out with his suitcase like a man going to a funeral, because in a way, he was. On the plane home, Dan's mind did something cruel, it played memories like highlights. Brooke laughing at their wedding reception. Brooke holding Ava as a newborn. Brooke asleep on the couch with Liam's head on her lap. Every memory came with a new shadow behind it. Was she already like this then? Was she always capable of this? Was he just too trusting to see it? By the time the plane landed, Dan felt like his nerves were stripped bare. He drove straight home. He didn't call. He didn't warn her. He pulled into the driveway at 2:18 p.m. on a Thursday. Brooke's car was there. And so was another car, silver sedan, parked slightly crooked like someone hadn't bothered to be careful. Dan sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, staring at that car, feeling a heat rise behind his eyes. He didn't storm to the front door. He didn't pound on it like some TV husband. He walked around the side of the house, through the gate, past the little plastic toys in the yard, past the herb garden Brooke never had time to water when Dan was home but somehow kept alive while he traveled. He reached the back patio and stopped. The sliding door was open. He heard laughter inside, low, adult laughter. Then Brooke's voice, soft and playful, the voice she used when she wanted to be irresistible. Dan stepped closer. Through the opening, he saw them in the kitchen. Brooke, his wife, leaned against the counter with a glass of white wine. The man, cap off now, hair dark and styled, stood close enough that his thigh pressed into hers. And then Brooke tilted her head and said something Dan couldn't hear, and the man laughed, and Brooke touched his face like she'd been doing it for weeks. Dan's hands clenched so hard his nails dug into his palms. He stood there, unseen for a moment, watching them like a stranger watching a crime. Then he stepped forward into the doorway. Brooke turned first. Her expression didn't immediately become guilt. It became shock, not because she felt bad, but because she'd been caught. Her eyes widened. The wine glass froze halfway to her mouth. Dan, she said, like she couldn't believe he'd shown up to his own life. The man turned slowly, eyes narrowing. He looked Dan up and down like Dan was the intruder. Dan's voice came out low. Who is he? Brooke's mouth opened, then closed. She swallowed. This is, she started. The man spoke before she could finish, casual and bold. Hey, man. Didn't realize you'd be home. Dan stared at him. The audacity almost made him laugh. Brooke found her voice, too fast, too high. Dan, this isn't. Dan held up a hand, palm outward. A stop sign. Don't, he said. Quiet. Controlled. Just don't. Brooke's eyes flashed, something like anger underneath the panic. You weren't supposed to be, she caught herself, pivoted. Why didn't you tell me you were coming home early? Dan looked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. Why didn't I tell you, he repeated. So you could, what? Clear the schedule. Hide him in the garage. Brooke set the wine glass down with a click that sounded too loud in the silence. The man shifted, uncomfortable now, realizing he might be stepping into something bigger than he'd signed up for. Brooke's face hardened, defensive. Dan, she said, slower. Can we talk privately? Dan's eyes didn't leave the man. Yeah, Dan said. He can leave. The man hesitated, looking to Brooke like she was the decision-maker. Brooke gave a small, tight nod. Go, she said, barely audible. The man grabbed his keys from the counter. As he walked past Dan, he muttered, this is between you two, like he was somehow the victim of inconvenient timing. Dan didn't respond. If he spoke, he wasn't sure he wouldn't lunge. When the door shut, Brooke exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding her breath for months. And then, shockingly, she rolled her eyes. Like Dan was being dramatic. Okay, Brooke said, crossing her arms. Before you start acting like some saint, Dan stared at her. That sentence. That tone. It landed like another betrayal on top of the first. He felt something in him fracture cleanly. They sat at the dining table because it was the only place where Dan felt like he could keep his hands still. The house looked the same, family photos, kids' art on the fridge, the faint smell of lemon cleaner. It should have felt familiar. Instead, it felt staged. Like a set built to convince the world they were a normal family. Brooke tried to take control immediately. First of all, she said, you're never here. Dan's jaw tightened. I work, he said. So we can have this house. So the kids, don't, Brooke snapped. Don't do the martyr thing. You chose that job. You could have found something local. Dan let out a sharp laugh, humorless. And we would have paid for this life with what, Brooke? Your boutique discount. Her eyes narrowed at the insult. There it is, she said. You don't respect me. Dan stared at her, stunned by the way she'd spun the conversation like a wheel of excuses. You had a man in our kitchen, he said. I saw him on the porch. I saw him in my house. Brooke's face twitched, the first real flicker of fear. You were watching me, she said, grasping at outrage. That's creepy, Dan. Dan's voice dropped. It's my doorbell camera. Brooke blinked like that detail was inconvenient. She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if intimacy could rewrite reality. Okay, she said. Yes. His name is Mason. Dan swallowed. The name made it real in a new way. How long? Dan asked. Brooke hesitated. Dan's hands curled into fists under the table. How long, he repeated, quieter. Brooke's eyes flickered away. A few months. Dan felt his stomach drop like an elevator cable snapping. A few months, he echoed. While I was out working. While I was calling you from hotel rooms. While our kids were asleep upstairs. Brooke's face tightened, and then she did the thing Dan had seen her do in arguments, she hardened into certainty. You don't get to act betrayed, she said. You abandoned me here half the month. Dan stared. He'd expected denial. Tears. Maybe begging. He hadn't expected her to sound like she was justifying it. I abandoned you. Dan said, voice rough. Brooke shrugged. I was lonely. I needed something. I needed to feel seen. Dan's eyes burned. I saw you, he said. I saw you the whole time. Brooke's mouth tightened like his words irritated her. You saw the version of me you wanted, she said. The mom. The wife. The schedule manager. Dan's throat tightened at the cruelty of it. So you became single when I left town, he said. Brooke didn't deny it. She looked down at her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was almost casual. When you're gone, she said, it feels like I'm free. Like I can breathe. Dan's heart thudded painfully. Free. That word. Like the marriage was a cage and Dan was the lock. Dan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a second as if looking up would hold him together. Then he looked at her again. What about Liam? Ava, he asked. What about them? Brooke's expression flashed with something like annoyance. Don't bring them into this, she said. Dan laughed again, small and broken. They're already in it, Brooke, he said. Because you brought a man into their home. Brooke's cheeks flushed. They were at school, she snapped. And Mason isn't, he's not around them. Dan's voice went quiet. Not around them yet, he corrected. Brooke flinched. Dan saw it then, she wasn't just cheating. She was building a second life. One where Dan was the paycheck and Mason was the fun. And Dan understood, in a sudden clear rush, that she had rehearsed this. She had said these lines in her head. Maybe to a friend. Maybe to Mason. Maybe in the mirror while putting on that black dress. Brooke tried to soften, switching tactics. I didn't plan for it to happen, she said. It just happened. And I didn't want to hurt you. Dan stared at her, incredulous. You didn't want to hurt me, he repeated. But you did it anyway. Brooke's eyes shone, finally tears, but they looked more like frustration than regret. I didn't think you'd find out, she whispered. And there it was. Not I'm sorry. Not I was wrong. Just, I didn't think you'd catch me. Dan's face went still. He realized he was looking at someone he didn't recognize. Someone who could look him in the eyes and make excuses while the echo of a stranger's laughter still lived in their kitchen. Dan stood up slowly. Brooke looked up, wary. What are you doing? She asked. Dan's voice was calm in a way that scared even him. I'm going upstairs, he said. To see my kids. Brooke's eyes widened. Don't wake them, Dan looked at her sharply. Don't tell me what to do, he said, and the coldness of his tone made her fall silent. He walked away, each step heavy, like he was moving through water. In Liam's room, Dan stood in the doorway and watched his son sleep. Liam's hair stuck up in a soft mess. His mouth was slightly open. One arm flung over a pillow like he'd been fighting dragons in a dream. Dan's chest ached so badly he had to press a hand against the doorframe. In Ava's room, she was curled around her stuffed rabbit, the one Dan had won for her at a county fair. Her cheeks were round and peaceful. She had no idea her parents' world had just collapsed. Dan felt tears spill down his face silently, without permission. He covered his mouth to keep from making a sound. Because that was the deepest cruelty of it, the kids were still innocent. The house still contained bedtime stories and cereal bowls and forgotten socks. And downstairs, their mother had been drinking wine with another man like she didn't have a family upstairs depending on her. Dan went into the hallway and leaned against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the carpet like a man who'd been shot. His mind did this awful thing where it replayed Brooke's words, when you're gone, it feels like I'm free. Dan had been killing himself to provide. He'd been away so they could afford dance classes and soccer camps and a backyard big enough for birthdays. And she'd used his absence like a vacation from being married. Anger came in waves, hot, trembling, blinding. It told him to go downstairs, scream, smash something, demand she confess to everyone they knew. Then sadness hit, heavier, like a wet blanket. He thought about their wedding vows. About the way Brooke had cried when she walked down the aisle, grabbing Dan's hands as if she'd finally found safety. He thought about all the trips he'd taken, the hotel beds, the lonely dinners, the moments he'd missed at home because he believed the sacrifice meant something. He felt humiliated. Not just betrayed, used. Downstairs, he heard Brooke moving around. Cabinets opening. Glass clinking. Life continuing. Dan wiped his face and forced himself to stand. He went into the guest room and closed the door. He sat on the bed and stared at the wall. For the first time in his adult life, Dan didn't know what came next. He only knew what couldn't continue. At some point, Brooke knocked softly, like politeness could undo the damage. "Dan," she said through the door. "We need to talk." Dan didn't answer. "Dan," she tried again, voice irritated now. "You can't just shut down." Dan finally spoke, voice low and rough. "I'm not shutting down," he said. "I'm listening to myself for the first time." Silence. Then Brooke's voice, smaller. "I didn't mean it like that," she said. Dan closed his eyes. Yes, she did. She meant it exactly like that. Because she'd been living it. Dan didn't sleep. He lay awake in the guest room, staring at the dark ceiling, hearing the soft creaks of the house, hearing Brooke move around downstairs and then upstairs, hearing a life rearranging itself. At 4:30 a.m., he got up, showered, and dressed like he was going to work. He wasn't going to work. He was going to war, quietly. He sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down facts, not feelings, Ring camera footage, dates and times. The silver sedan make/model from memory. Brooke's recent nights out. Any financial changes, new clothing charges, salon appointments, bar tabs. Who could vouch for Dan's travel schedule and parenting involvement? When Brooke came downstairs in pajamas, hair messy, she looked startled to see him calm. "I made coffee," she said cautiously, as if offering caffeine could fix infidelity. Dan didn't look up. "I'm meeting with a lawyer today," he said. Brooke froze. Her voice jumped. "A lawyer?" "Dan, come on." Dan finally looked at her. His eyes were tired, but steady. "This isn't a conversation," he said. "It's a decision." Brooke's face tightened, and for a moment the mask slipped again. "Not remorse, fear." "Are you going to take the kids from me?" she demanded, sharp. Dan's jaw tensed. "I'm going to protect them," he said. "And I'm going to protect myself." Brooke scoffed, defensive. "So you're just throwing away 11 years? Over a mistake?" Dan stared at her. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk," he said quietly. "You built a second life." Brooke's eyes flashed. "You weren't here." Dan stood slowly, the chair scraping the floor. "And you weren't married," he said. "Not when I was gone. Not when it mattered." He grabbed his keys and walked toward the door. Brooke followed, voice rising. "You can't do this to me," she hissed. "You'll ruin everything." Dan paused at the doorway and looked back at her, really looked. "You already did," he said. And he walked out. Driving away from the house, Dan didn't feel triumphant. He felt hollow. But underneath the hollow was something firm for the first time in months, clarity. He couldn't control Brooke. He couldn't rewrite what she'd done. He couldn't make her care. What he could do was stop sacrificing himself for someone who treated his absence like freedom and his presence like inconvenience. Dan didn't know yet how the divorce would go, how ugly Brooke might get when she realized the comfort of her double life was ending. He only knew this: he wasn't going to be the man who begged a woman to stop living like she was single. He was going to be the man who showed her what single actually meant. Daniel Riley met his attorney in a squat brick office park that smelled like printer toner and burnt coffee. The sign on the door read Harding and Klein, Family Law, the kind of place people went because something they thought was permanent had turned out to be conditional. The attorney, Marissa Harding, was in her 40s with sharp eyes and a calm voice that never rose. She looked at Dan the way an ER nurse might look at a bleeding patient, sympathetic, but focused. "Tell me what happened," she said, pen poised. Dan didn't give her a speech. He gave her facts. The ring footage. The repeat visits. The timing around his trips. The car in the driveway. Brooke's admission, a few months. The excuses. The word that kept ringing in his head like an alarm, free. Marissa didn't gasp. She didn't look shocked. She just nodded and asked for specifics. "Do you have copies of the footage?" "Yes," Dan said. He slid his phone across the desk. "Saved in multiple places." "Good," she said, and her tone made Dan realize how quickly his life had become a case file. "Any indication the children were present during these visits?" "No," Dan said, then hesitated. "I don't know. Not directly. But it was our house. Their home. He was there in the daytime." Marissa's pen tapped once. "And how's your involvement with the kids?" Dan answered honestly. He traveled. He also did breakfasts when he was home. He coached Liam's soccer when his schedule allowed. He took Ava to preschool. He was not a perfect father, but he was present. Marissa leaned back. "Here's the reality," she said. "Ohio is not a fault-only state for divorce, but misconduct can matter in certain contexts, especially if it impacts children or finances. Custody is about best interests. Not punishment." Dan stared at the wood grain on her desk, trying to keep his hands from shaking. "I'm not trying to punish her," he said, and then surprised himself by adding, "I'm trying to survive her." Marissa's expression softened a fraction. "Then we do this clean," she said. "You keep your voice down. You don't threaten. You don't write anything you'd hate to see on a courtroom screen. You document. You protect the kids. You let the process do the talking." Dan nodded. It felt wrong that his marriage was going to end in paperwork and timestamps. But it also felt, strangely, like relief. Like a door finally opening after months of stale air. Marissa slid a sheet across the desk. "If you want to move forward," she said, "we'll file and have her served. There will be anger. Denial. Bargaining. Don't get pulled into it." Dan stared at the line where his signature would go. Then he signed. Brooke didn't take being served like a woman who had made a choice and accepted consequences. She took it like a woman being attacked. The process server arrived on a Saturday morning when Dan was home. He'd insisted on being there, partly to protect the kids from seeing it, and partly because a small part of him still couldn't believe Brooke would let it get this far. Brooke opened the door with a bright, performative smile that died the second she saw the envelope. "What is this?" she demanded, eyes narrowing. "Ma'am, you've been served," the server said evenly. Brooke's face went white, then flushed crimson like blood rushing back. She turned on Dan as if he'd personally mailed the papers with a smirk. "You did this?" she hissed. Dan kept his voice low. The kids were in the living room with cartoons on, blissfully ignorant. "I told you I was meeting with a lawyer," he said. Brooke's laugh was sharp and brittle. "You can't just," she started, voice rising, and then the kids' laughter from the other room pulled her back into awareness. She lowered her tone, but the venom stayed. "You can't just decide it's over." Dan looked at her. "It ended when you brought him into the house," he said. Brooke's eyes flicked toward the living room like she was calculating her next move. Then she snatched the papers and slammed the door so hard the picture frames on the wall rattled. She stormed into the kitchen, flipping through the pages like the words were insults. "This is insane," she said. "You're trying to take everything." "I'm trying to keep the kids stable," Dan said. Brooke's face contorted. "You're doing this because you're embarrassed," she spat. "Because your little pride got hurt." Dan stared at her for a long moment. His pride. Like that was the tragedy. "I'm doing this," he said slowly, "because I don't want to live with someone who lies to my face and calls it loneliness." Brooke's eyes flashed, and then, like a switch, she softened, stepping closer, voice suddenly gentle. "Dan," she said, and she reached for his arm like muscle memory, "we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can." He stepped back. Brooke's hand hung in the air, then dropped. "You don't get to pivot now," Dan said quietly. "You didn't want to fix it when you were free. You want to fix it now because the bill showed up." Her eyes filled, but the tears looked angry. "You're really going to do this to me," she whispered, like he was the betrayer. Dan didn't argue anymore. That was the new rule. Marissa had told him, "Don't wrestle with someone who changes the rules mid-fight." "I'm going to take Liam to soccer," he said, and walked out of the kitchen. Brooke stood there staring after him, papers trembling in her grip. In the weeks that followed, Brooke tried every version of herself to see which one would pull Dan back. There was the wounded wife, soft voice, trembling lip, long text messages late at night, "I miss you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Then the furious wife, caps lock, insults, accusations, "You were never here. You don't deserve the kids. You're cold. You're controlling." Then the seductive wife, wearing the lingerie Dan had seen once in the laundry and pretending it was for him, leaning too close in the hallway, saying, "Remember when we used to be us?" Dan stopped sleeping in the guest room and started sleeping in the basement on an old couch, because the house began to feel like a battlefield with children living in the crossfire. He lived on routine and restraint. He spoke to Brooke about the kids. About schedules. About logistics. He didn't talk about feelings because Brooke treated feelings like bargaining chips. When he slipped, when anger broke through, he regretted it immediately. One night Brooke cornered him in the laundry room, blocking the door with her body. "Tell me the truth," she said, eyes glossy. "Is there someone else?" Dan stared at her, exhausted. "No," he said. "There's just, the absence of you." Brooke flinched like he'd slapped her. "You're so dramatic," she whispered, but her voice cracked. Dan walked past her, carrying a basket of tiny socks that suddenly felt like the saddest thing on earth. Mason, the man from the porch, wasn't the knight Brooke had built in her head. At first, Brooke clung to him like a life raft. Dan learned this the way people learn terrible things now, not from confession, but from the fallout. Brooke started leaving the house dressed up on nights she didn't have the kids. She started coming home later, smelling like sweet cocktails and expensive cologne. It was as if she was doubling down on her freedom, determined to prove it was worth the price. But freedom, Dan realized, often turned out to be loneliness with better lighting. Mason didn't show up when Brooke cried. He didn't attend the mediation meeting. He didn't sit in the living room and help Liam with homework. He didn't hold Ava when she had a fever. He was there for the fun part. And when the fun part became consequences, he began to fade. One afternoon, Brooke's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs. Dan wasn't trying to spy, he'd stopped touching her phone out of sheer disgust, but the screen lit with a preview that felt like a punch. "Mason, I can't do this drama. I told you, I'm not trying to be somebody's stepdad." Dan stared at the message until the screen went dark again. He felt no satisfaction. Just a bleak confirmation of what he already knew. Brooke had gambled her family on a man who didn't even want to be inconvenienced. That night, Brooke came home with mascara streaked down her face, eyes red and swollen. Dan heard her crying in their bedroom, the door shut. He sat in the basement, staring at the ceiling, feeling something inside him shift. Not pity. Not love. Just the quiet realization that Brooke's pain didn't restore his trust. It didn't undo the porch kiss. It didn't wash the stain off the kitchen floor. It was simply Brooke meeting the reality she tried to dodge. The mediation was held in a beige office with a mediator who spoke like an HR manager. Dan sat on one side with Marissa. Brooke sat on the other side with her attorney, a man with slick hair and a constant look of mild annoyance. Brooke wore a fitted blazer and heavy makeup. She looked polished, like she was trying to appear unshaken. But her leg bounced under the table, and Dan could see the tension around her mouth. The mediator smiled too much. "We're here to reach an agreement that supports the children and allows both parties to move forward," she said. Brooke leaned forward immediately. "I want the house," she said. "The kids should stay where they are." Dan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "I'm open to the kids staying in the school district," he said. "But I'm not paying for a house I'm not living in while she plays single." Brooke's attorney scoffed. "Mr. Riley, your travel schedule," Marissa cut in smoothly. "Mr. Riley has already initiated a transfer to a local role," she said. "And he has extensive documentation of parental involvement. Additionally, we have evidence of repeated overnight guests during his work trips." Brooke's head snapped toward Marissa. "You're bringing that up?" Brooke hissed. Marissa didn't blink. "We're bringing up anything that impacts stability," she said. Dan watched Brooke's confidence flicker. The mediator raised a hand. "Let's focus," she said. "Custody first." Brooke's voice sharpened. "He's punishing me," she said. "He wants to ruin me." Dan finally looked directly at her. "No," he said, calm enough to scare himself. "I want to detach my life from yours." Brooke's eyes filled again. "You're so cold," she whispered. Dan didn't respond. He'd learned the trap. If he defended himself, he'd end up in the same circular argument where Brooke was the victim and Dan was the villain. They talked numbers. Schedules. Holidays. Child support. The language was clinical. The pain behind it was not. When the mediator suggested a temporary 50-50 plan, week on, week off, Brooke's face tightened. "I can't," she said quickly. Dan blinked. "You can't what?" he asked before he could stop himself. Brooke's gaze darted away. My work schedule," she said, too fast. "I don't have the flexibility." Dan stared at her. She'd had flexibility to host a man in their house. Flexibility to go out late. Flexibility to live free. But now that parenting was split evenly, now that she'd have to carry her share without Dan absorbing the weight, she suddenly didn't have flexibility. Marissa's voice stayed neutral. "Then we can discuss a primary custody arrangement with expanded visitation," she said. Brooke's head snapped up. "No," she said, voice rising. "No, I'm their mother." Dan watched the panic deepen into rage. And that was the first time he understood something essential. Brooke didn't want the kids because she treasured the responsibility. She wanted the kids because she needed the identity. Because without wife and mom, she didn't know what she was. And Dan, quietly, wasn't going to keep holding up the structure of her life so she could keep playing the part she liked best. The divorce took months. The house sold. They split the proceeds. Dan moved into a smaller place, a 3-bedroom townhouse 10 minutes from the kids' school. It wasn't the dream house. The walls were thinner. The backyard was basically a patch of grass. But it was peaceful. Dan bought new sheets. He hung up Liam's drawings. He let Ava pick a ridiculous lamp shaped like a unicorn, because he could. He stopped traveling. His boss had grumbled at first, but Dan pushed back with a kind of calm stubbornness he'd never had before. "If you need someone who lives on planes," he'd said, "I'm not your guy anymore." A younger guy took the travel role, eager and hungry. Dan took a local project and, for the first time in years, ate dinner at his own table with his kids on a weeknight. The first few weeks of 50-50 were messy. Liam forgot his backpack at Brooks. Ava cried during transitions. Dan felt like his heart was being tugged in opposite directions. One night Liam asked, voice small, "Did Mom stop loving you?" Dan's throat tightened. Dan sat with him on the edge of the bed, took a breath, and chose honesty without cruelty. "Your mom and I," he said carefully, "weren't being good to each other anymore. Sometimes grown-ups mess up. But she loves you. I love you. That part doesn't change." Liam nodded slowly, absorbing it with the seriousness only kids have. "Are you mad at her?" he asked. Dan swallowed. The truth was complicated. "I was," he admitted. "I still get mad sometimes. But being mad all the time is like carrying a heavy backpack. I'm trying to put it down." Liam looked at him like he didn't fully understand, then leaned forward and hugged him hard. Dan held his son and felt something loosen in his chest. Not forgiveness. Just release. Brooks' life didn't fall apart all at once. It unraveled. First, Mason vanished completely. Dan never saw him again, but Brooks' mood swung wildly between bitterness and desperation, like she couldn't believe the world didn't reward her for choosing herself. Then Brooks started missing little things. Liam showed up to Dan's place on Brooks' exchange day with no lunchbox, no homework folder, no coat. "Mom was asleep," Liam said quietly. "She said she forgot." Ava began clinging to Dan during drop-offs, crying and whispering, "Don't go." Dan tried to keep his face neutral, tried not to react in front of the kids. But every time he noticed a crack in Brooks' parenting, fear flared in him. Not triumph. Fear. He didn't want Brooke destroyed. He wanted Brooke stable enough not to hurt the kids with her instability. But Brooke seemed determined to turn her freedom into a cliff. She began posting on social media like she was 22 again, glam shots, captions about new beginnings, vague quotes about being reborn. It looked like confidence until you looked closer and saw how hard she was trying to convince herself. The boutique cut her hours. The manager didn't say why, but Dan heard through a mutual friend that Brooke had been showing up late and snapping at customers. One night Brooke called Dan at 1:12 a.m. He didn't answer. She called again. Dan answered the third time, heart pounding, because his brain went straight to the kids. "What?" he said, voice tight. "Are the kids okay?" Brooke's voice was slurred. "They're fine," she giggled, and it made Dan's stomach drop. Can you talk to me?" Dan sat up in bed, the townhouse quiet. "Brooke," he said, cold creeping into his tone, "are you drunk?" "No," she said, and then laughed like it was a cute accusation. "Maybe a little." Dan rubbed his face. "Why are you calling me?" he asked. There was a pause, then her voice turned small. "I messed up," she whispered. "I really messed up." Dan waited, jaw clenched. "I thought I'd be happy," she said, and the words came out like confession. "I thought, when you were gone, it felt like I was alive again. But now it's just quiet. And I don't know what to do with myself." Dan stared into the dark. This was the part, he realized, where old Dan would have comforted her. Would have tried to fix her. But the comfort he gave her would come at the cost of his own healing. So he kept his voice firm. "You need to call a friend," he said. "Or your sister. Or a therapist. You can't call me like this." Brooke's breath hitched. "You hate me," she whispered. Dan's voice was steady. "I don't hate you," he said. "But I can't be your emotional support person anymore. That was the job you quit." Brooke went silent. Then, softly, "Okay." And she hung up. Dan sat there for a long time afterward, shaking, not with anger, but with the strange grief of finally seeing Brooke as she was, a woman who had blown up her own life and expected Dan to help her sift through the rubble. The custody changed gradually, not because Dan asked for revenge, but because the kids started showing the wear. Ava began having stomachaches on exchange days. Liam's teacher emailed Dan about missed assignments during Brooke's weeks. Dan documented everything the way Marissa told him to, dates, behaviors, missed pickups, but he never spoke badly about Brooke to the kids. He kept his tone calm. He made dinner. He made lunches. He read bedtime stories until his throat was scratchy. He built steadiness like a wall. Brooke grew resentful of that steadiness, as if Dan's stability made her look worse by comparison. One afternoon at a drop-off, Brooke stood in Dan's driveway, eyes rimmed red, arms crossed hard over her chest. "You're turning them against me," she accused. Dan looked at her, tired. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "I'm showing up." Brooke's lips trembled. "They love you more," she whispered, and there was something childlike in it, like she couldn't believe love was tied to effort. Dan softened his voice, not for her, but for the kids who might be listening. "They love you," he said. "But they need consistency." Brooke laughed bitterly. "Consistency," she repeated. "You mean you want to be the hero?" Dan's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't want to be the hero," he said. "I want to be their dad." Brooke's face twisted. "You think you're so righteous," she snapped. "Like you never did anything wrong." Dan held her gaze. "I did plenty wrong," he said. "I was gone too much. I worked too much. I assumed love was enough without attention. But none of that made you cheat." Brooke flinched. Dan's voice stayed quiet and lethal. "That choice was yours." Brooke stared at him like she wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, she knew. Brooke's crash came the way crashes often do, not as a dramatic explosion, but as a final consequence she couldn't talk her way out of. She lost her apartment after falling behind on rent. Dan didn't know the full details, he only found out because Brooke called, frantic, saying she needed to borrow money. Dan's stomach turned. "No," he said. Brooke's voice rose. "I'm the mother of your children," she snapped. "You're just going to let me be homeless?" Dan's voice stayed steady. "I'm going to make sure the kids are safe," he said. "I'm not going to keep financing your choices." Brooke's breath came quick and angry. "You're punishing me," she said again, like it was her favorite narrative. Dan closed his eyes. "Brooke," he said, and his voice finally held emotion, tiredness, sadness, finality. "The punishment is the reality you made." Brooke screamed something sharp and ugly and hung up. A week later, Marissa called Dan. "Brooke's attorney requested an emergency modification," she said. "She's relocating temporarily. She wants to reduce her parenting time." Dan's throat tightened. "Is she okay?" he asked despite himself. Marissa paused. "She's unstable," she said carefully. "This may be the best outcome for the children." Dan felt a wave of conflicting feelings, anger, relief, grief, all tangled. The new arrangement gave Dan primary custody with Brooke having supervised visitation for a period, transitioning to unsupervised when she could demonstrate stability. It wasn't a punishment. It was a safety plan. When Dan told Liam and Ava that they'd be staying with him more, Ava looked relieved. Liam looked sad. "Is Mom sick?" Liam asked quietly. Dan chose his words like stepping stones. "Mom's having a hard time," he said. "She needs to get help so she can be the best mom she can be." Liam nodded, eyes glossy. "Can she get better?" he asked. Dan swallowed. "I hope so," he said softly. "I really do." Dan's happiness didn't arrive like fireworks. It arrived like breathing without pain. It was the quiet of a home where he didn't brace for sarcasm. The calm of checking a doorbell alert without dread. The comfort of knowing where the kids were and who they were with. He went to therapy, not because he wanted to move on fast, but because he didn't want Brooke's choices to poison the rest of his life. In therapy, he said the things he'd never let himself say out loud, that he felt foolish, that he felt replaceable, that some nights he still woke up sweating, hearing Brooks laugh in the kitchen with another man. His therapist didn't offer magic. She offered language. Betrayal trauma. Cognitive loops. Grief. Self-worth. Dan learned to stop asking why and start asking what now. He took up running in the mornings, not to get shredded or impress anyone, but because the steady rhythm of his feet on pavement made his brain quiet. He started cooking real meals. He learned Ava liked her eggs, yellow but not wet, and Liam hated onions with a passion that felt personal. He built a new life around presence instead of providing from afar. And somewhere in the middle of that new life, he met someone, slowly, accidentally. Her name was Rachel. She was Liam's friend's mom, a physical therapist with laugh lines and a blunt sense of humor. They started talking at soccer practices, swapping small complaints about schedules and snack duty. Dan didn't jump into anything. He didn't need a replacement wife. He needed peace. Rachel didn't chase him. She didn't pressure him. She just existed nearby, steady and kind. One afternoon after practice, as the kids ran ahead, Rachel walked beside Dan and said, casually, "You seem lighter lately." Dan blinked. "Do I?" he asked. Rachel shrugged. "Yeah," she said. "Like you're not carrying something heavy anymore." Dan stared at the field, the kids' laughter drifting on the wind, and felt emotion rise unexpectedly. "I put it down," he said quietly. Rachel nodded like she understood. They started dating months later. Slowly. Carefully. Dan told her the truth early, not the sanitized version. Rachel listened and said, "That's awful," and then added, "But you're not broken. You're just hurt." It was such a simple sentence, and it hit Dan like water in a desert. Brooke watched Dan's life stabilize from the outside, and it seemed to make her unravel faster. She showed up late to visitation, then not at all. She sent angry texts at midnight, then apologized in the morning. She blamed Dan, blamed Mason, blamed loneliness, blamed the universe. But she rarely blamed herself. When she did, it didn't last. Self-awareness was too painful to sit with for long. The last time Dan saw Brooke up close was at a supervised visitation center a year after the divorce filing. She looked thinner. Her hair was dull, hastily pulled back. Her eyes were tired in a way makeup couldn't fix. Ava ran to her cautiously. Liam walked slower, like he didn't want to hope too hard. Brooke hugged them both too tightly, face buried in their hair like she was trying to inhale the life she'd thrown away. She looked up at Dan, and for a moment her face softened into something almost human. "I didn't think it would end like this," she whispered. Dan's chest tightened. He kept his voice calm. "No one does," he said. Brooke's eyes glistened. "I loved you," she said, and it sounded like she meant it, which somehow made it worse. Dan held her gaze. "I believe you," he said quietly. "But love isn't what you do in secret. It's what you protect." Brooke's lips trembled. She looked away like she couldn't bear to hear it. As the kids walked into the visitation room with the supervisor, Brooke lingered at the door. "Are you happy?" she asked suddenly, voice sharp with desperation. Dan paused. He thought about the porch footage, the kitchen laughter, the months of anger, the nights on the basement couch, the slow rebuilding, the quiet mornings, the way his kids slept peacefully now. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. "Yes," he said softly. "I am." Brooke's face tightened as if his happiness was the final proof that her story, the one where she was the victim, was collapsing. She swallowed hard. "Of course you are," she muttered, and walked away. By the second year after the divorce, Daniel Riley no longer felt like a man defined by betrayal. He felt like a man who had survived one. He learned that being reliable doesn't guarantee loyalty in return. That you can give someone everything you have and still not be enough if they're chasing a feeling they don't know how to create inside themselves. He learned that confrontation doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it just reveals character. And he learned that the opposite of love isn't hate. It's entitlement. Brooke had felt entitled to a free life while keeping the security Dan provided. She wanted the thrill without the cost. The romance without the responsibility. The identity without the work. When reality finally collected its debt, her life didn't fall apart because Dan took revenge. It fell apart because the foundation she'd relied on, truth, trust, partnership, had been something she took for granted until it was gone. If Dan could speak to someone sitting in a hotel room staring at a doorbell alert, he'd say this: don't confront in a rage. Document first. Don't beg someone to choose you. If they wanted to, they already would have. Protect your kids from the war. Let them keep their childhood even if you lose your marriage. And don't confuse starting over with failing. Starting over is often the first honest thing you do after being lied to. Daniel didn't end up winning. He ended up living. And once he understood the difference, he never looked back.